So if you just look at the letters, right? O-U-G-H, you can pronounce those same four letters in like 5 entirely different ways.
Oh, at least, yeah.
Right. You have enough cough, though, through, and thought.
Yep.
5 completely different sounds for the exact same 4 letters. And if you're wondering why, well, it's because you, me, literally everyone else typing on a modern smartphone right now, we are essentially using the phonetic spelling of like a 15th century medieval merchant.
Which is just wild to think about.
It's insane. So today, we are taking a deep dive into the absolute unmitigated chaos of the English language.
Chaos is honestly the best word for it, because it really is a structural free-for-all. I mean, usually when you learn a new system, whether it's a programming language or biological taxonomy, you expect some kind of logical architecture.
Yeah, you want a blueprint.
Exactly. You got rules that apply uniformly across the board.
Yeah.
But English absolutely does not offer that. It is this linguistic landscape drawn by a dozen different architects who are entirely hostile to one another.
Just fighting over the blueprints.
Yeah, and working in the dark over the course of like 1,500 years.
Which is why our mission today is to really unpack this bizarre, turbulent history. Because based on the mountain of sources we've gathered for this deep dive, we're going to explore how English became this globally dominant, deeply mongrel, grammatically inconsistent language that somehow boasts an estimated 1 million words.
And, for anyone learning or just using English today, understanding this chaotic history isn't just trivia. It's actually the ultimate cheat code.
The cheat code, I like that.
It really is. It explains why the language behaves the way it does. The history of English is quite literally the mechanical explanation for English.
Okay, let's unpack this because the stakes here are kind of wild. By the standards of the world's great languages, English is relatively young, yet somehow it functions as the primary language of international aviation. It's the language of global diplomacy. It dominates science, finance. It's an official language in over 60 countries. And, more people are learning it right this second than at any previous point in human history.
It's a staggering level of dominance, especially for a language that, structurally speaking, is held together by duct tape and historical accident.
Duct tape and vibes.
Exactly. And to understand how that happened, we have to start at ground zero, Look at the foundation this deeply weird house was built on. And the story doesn't actually start in Britain. It starts with this massive power vacuum in the 5th century CE.
Right, the Romans pulling out of the British Isles.
Yeah, so the Roman legions had occupied Britain for nearly 400 years. But as the empire fractured, they withdrew. And they left behind physical infrastructure, like
roads, aqueducts, cities.
Exactly. And they left behind Christianity. But linguistically, their impact on the everyday population was virtually zero.
Right, really? After 400 years?
Barely a dent. The native people of Britain were Celtic-speaking, so their language was closely related to modern Welsh and Cornish. They had absorbed maybe a few Latin administrative terms, but the vast majority of the population just kept speaking Celtic.
Okay, so you have this vulnerable Celtic-speaking population, this massive power vacuum left by the Roman military, and presumably a lot of fertile land.
Which naturally invited migration. So into that vacuum moved these Germanic tribes from northwestern Europe, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes.
And Anglo-Saxons.
Right. And as these Germanic settlers spread across southern and eastern Britain over the 5th and 6th centuries, they didn't assimilate into the Celtic culture. They aggressively displaced it.
They just pushed them out.
Pushed them right to the edges. They forced the native Celtic-speaking populations west into Cornwall, into Wales, and across the Irish Sea, completely overletting the linguistic landscape.
So the Celtic languages were basically pushed to the geographical fringes of the island. And the language those Germanic tribes brought is what we now call Old English or, Anglo-Saxon. And this is what blows my mind. If I picked up a manuscript of Old English right now, I wouldn't be able to read it at all.
Not a chance.
Our sources highlight the opening line of the epic poem Beowulf. It goes, give me a second. Hoyt, we gardina in gerdigum theotsinga frimfunon.
Beautifully pronounced, by the way.
Thank you, I tried. But I don't recognize a single syllable of that. It sounds like, I don't know, a spell from a fancy novel, not the language I'm speaking right now.
Without specialist training, it is entirely unrecognizable to modern eyes and ears. Because Old English was structurally a totally different beast. It was highly complex and incredibly rigid.
How so?
Well, for example, it utilized a rigorous system of grammatical gender. Nouns were masculine, feminine, or neuter, purely by arbitrary grammatical assignment.
Okay, meaning a sword might be masculine, A shield might be feminine, and a cloud might be neuter.
Exactly. And that assigned gender forced every single adjective and article associated with that noun to change its spelling and its pronunciation to match.
Oh, wow. That sounds exhausting.
It gets worse. Furthermore, Old English operated on a really complex case system.
Okay, can you break down the mechanics of a case system for us? Because modern English only has, like, the absolute faintest ghosts of this left.
For sure. So in a case system, a noun actually changes its physical form depending on its job in the sentence.
Okay.
Take the word for stone, which in Old English was stan. If the stone is doing an action, like the stone rolled, it's just stan.
Got it.
But if you throw the stone, making it the direct object, the word might stay stan. But if you were talking about the surface of the stone, it becomes stans.
With an ES on the end.
Right. If you throw something to or at the stone, it becomes stan. The ending of the word constantly shifts to tell the listener who is doing what to whom. And on top of that, you had a rich, really complicated system of verb conjugations.
Man. So Old English was essentially like a highly complex, rigid computer operating system, totally incompatible with modern English, like a heavy, unforgiving Linux kernel or something.
That is a perfect analogy.
It had intricate dependencies, strict codes, and if you got one suffix wrong, the whole sentence basically crashed.
Yeah, you get a syntax error.
Right. But this brings up a massive question. If it is so unrecognizable and the grammatical operating system is completely incompatible with how we speak today, why do we even call it English? Like, what actually survived this rigid Germanic framework?
That's the million-dollar question. So the complex architecture, the cases, the genders, those intricate verb endings that all rusted away over time, but the foundational structural code survived. The most common words, the absolute bedrock of modern English, are entirely Anglo-Saxon.
Basically the grammatical glue.
Exactly.
Right.
Think about the verbs we use hundreds of times a day, where it's like be, have, do, say, get, make, go, no, take, come, see, want.
All Old English.
All of them. And think about the function words that construct a sentence, right? The a, of, and to, in is that it, he, she, we. All of these are Old English. They are the nuts and bolts of the language.
So the heavy machinery fell apart, but the bolts holding it together are exactly what those Germanic tribes were shouting to each other in the 5th century.
Pretty much, yeah.
But a system that rigid is also incredibly fragile, right? It didn't just naturally evolve into a simpler form over a few decades. It took a massive external shock to break the Old English operating system.
It took an invasion.
Here come the Vikings.
Here they come. By the late 8th century, waves of Norse-speaking Scandinavians, the Vikings, began raiding and eventually settling in Britain. And by the 9th century, they had taken over massive swaths of northern and eastern England, establishing a territory known as the Danelaw.
And this isn't just a change in, like, political leadership. The Danelaw becomes this massive linguistic blender.
What's fascinating here is the mechanics of bilingual contact. You have Anglo-Saxons and Norsemen living side by side, needing to trade, farm, and survive together. Now, Old Norse and Old English were closely related Germanic languages.
Right, they were linguistic cousins, so I'd imagine they could point to, I don't know, a horse or a sword, and the root words would sound pretty similar.
Very similar. The root for horse or house was mutually intelligible. But remember that rigid case system we talked about?
Oh, the suffixes.
Yes. The complex endings that told you if a word was a subject, an object, or possessive, those were completely different between Old English and Old Norse.
Okay, so picture this. An Anglo-Saxon and a Viking are trying to negotiate the sale of a horse, right?
Okay. Yeah.
They both know it's a horse, but the Anglo-Saxon puts a complicated suffix on it that means I'm selling this horse to you, and the Viking hears a suffix that sounds like the horse belongs to my grandfather.
Exactly. It's a grammatical train wreck.
But wait, if the languages were so similar, wouldn't they just blend seamlessly? Why didn't they just learn each other's endings?
Because sustained bilingual contact between adults usually erodes grammatical complexity. They didn't have the time or the inclination to sit down and learn each other's complex declensions. They had crops to plant and things to sell. So to trade and survive, at a pure practical necessity, they just started dropping the confusing endings. English grammar simplified out of pure survival instinct.
It's like trying to run that complex Linux program, but the Vikings only know basic Windows commands, so they just start deleting the complex code until the program boots up. Just say horse, forget the suffix.
That sustained contact is widely considered a primary driver for the dramatic simplification of English grammar. The case system collapsed. Grammatical gender faded away. Verb endings were stripped down to the bare minimum.
And while they were stripping down the grammar, they were aggressively trading vocabulary too,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Because there are so many everyday Norse words that just slip straight into the English stream, words that feel so fundamental to us that we assume they must be native English, like sky, skin, egg, knife, husband, wrong, ugly, happy.
Weak, die. The list goes on. But the ultimate proof of how deeply these two languages fused is what the Vikings did to English pronouns.
Which is incredibly rare. I mean, languages borrow nouns all the time, like adopting the word sushi or taco. But borrowing a pronoun is like swapping out a load-bearing pillar in the middle of a building.
It almost never happens because pronouns are the deepest part of that structural glue we were talking about. But Old English had a major problem. Its native third-person plural pronouns, the equivalents of they, them, and their, sounded dangerously similar to its singular pronouns, especially since everyone was rapidly dropping their word endings.
Oh, so he and they sounded basically the same.
Yeah, it was causing rampant confusion in everyday speech.
So the English just looked over at the Norse settlers and realized, hey, your pronouns are way clearer than ours.
And they entirely adopted the Norse pronouns. They, them, and their are Viking words. It is an incredible testament to an extraordinarily intimate level of cultural and linguistic merging. Thanks to the Vikings, English was getting streamlined, lean, and efficient.
Which makes the next chapter feel almost tragic, because English is finally figuring itself out, dropping the baggage, getting practical, and then a completely different linguistic family is violently forced directly on top of it.
Yep. October 14th, 1066, the Battle of Hastings.
Hmm.
William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, crosses the Channel, defeats the English forces, and seizes the throne. And he brings his Norman ruling class with him.
And their language, which is Old French, a Romance language derived from Latin, with absolutely no relation to the Germanic roots of English or Norse.
None whatsoever. And overnight, the linguistic landscape of power in England flips completely.
Yeah.
The royal court, the church hierarchy, the legal system, the government administration, all of it begins operating exclusively in Old French.
Just try to picture the linguistic fallout of this for the average person. You're like an English farmer. And suddenly the lord who owns the land you work on speaks a language you cannot understand. The bailiff who collects your taxes speaks French. The judge who presides over your disputes speaks French.
It was incredibly alienating. For 300 years, England functioned as a strictly stratified bilingual society. English completely lost its prestige. It ceased to be the language of literature or statecraft. It became the language of dirt, farming, and servitude.
But it didn't die.
No, it didn't. It went underground and basically marinated in French.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because this marination creates what I like to think of as a massive linguistic thrift store. English became a place where you can essentially buy two versions of the exact same concept.
The dual vocabulary, yeah.
Right, because the French vocabulary flooded into English, but it was entirely based on class and domains of power, so it didn't replace the English words, it just layered right on top of them.
Exactly. The basic glue words remained English, but French provided the vocabulary of authority, refinement, and governance. So from French, we get words like government, parliament, justice, court, judge, prison, tax, sovereign, and crown.
It's literally the language of the people giving the orders, and the people taking the orders were still speaking English, which means we ended up with this incredible system of synonyms. You have the blunt English word and the elevated French word. Like you can ask a question using an Old English word, or you can interrogate someone using French.
Right. You can begin a task in English, or you can commence it in French. You can be friendly, which feels warm and Anglo-Saxon, or you can be amicable, which feels a bit more cold, legalistic in French.
Yeah.
A peasant lives in a house, but a lord lives in a mansion.
The meat words are my absolute favorite example of this, though.
Oh, it perfectly illustrates the social dynamic. So the Anglo-Saxon peasants were the ones raising the livestock, right? They were out in the mud tending the animals. So the living, breathing animals retained their Germanic names. Cow, pig, calf, sheep.
But those Anglo-Saxon peasants weren't eating the meat.
No, they couldn't afford to.
They were serving it to the Norman lords in the dining halls.
Therefore, once the animal is slaughtered and prepared for the table, it takes the French name. The cow becomes beef, from the French boeuf. The pig becomes pork, from pork. The calf becomes veal, from veau, and the sheep becomes mutton, from mouton. It is literal social history embedded right in our everyday vocabulary.
That is just brilliant. And because Latin was also heavily utilized by the church and scholars during this time, English developed like a three-tiered system of synonyms. You have the blunt English word, the elevated French word, and the highly academic Latin word.
A great example of that is you can be kingly, which is English, you can be royal, which is French, or you can be regal, which is Latin.
Or you can rise in English, mount in French, or ascend in Latin. It's just this massive embarrassment of riches.
It really is. It resulted in a massive bloated vocabulary. But the structural reality on the ground was still incredibly messy. Because by the 14th century, this is around Chaucer's era, the ruling class gradually realized they had to shift back to speaking English.
Partly because the Hundred Years' War with France made speaking French really politically awkward, right?
Yeah, exactly. Being at war with France for a century makes speaking French at the English royal court a terrible political look. It was the language of the enemy. Plus, administering a predominantly English-speaking population in a foreign language was highly inefficient. So, English returns to the halls of power. But here's the catch. It isn't a unified language. It is deeply, deeply fractured.
Right, because a merchant from London and a farmer from the north of England would genuinely struggle to understand each other at this point.
Oh, absolutely. And written English was pure anarchy. There were no dictionaries. Scribes basically spelled words based entirely on how they personally pronounced them in their specific regional accent. The word church might be spelled 10 different ways in the exact same manuscript.
Okay, so with hundreds of thousands of words layered from Germanic, Norse, and French sources, writing this language down was absolute chaos. And the attempt to fix this chaos resulted in English's greatest modern frustration. Standardization sounds great in theory, but why did it make modern spelling such a nightmare for the listener today?
It all comes down to technology and a tragic sense of timing. In 1476, a man named William Caxton brought the printing press to London. And a printing press demands standardization.
Right, you can't just wing it.
No, you cannot cast hundreds of variations of physical metal type for the same word. It takes too long. Caxton had to choose one spelling, lock it into a metal frame, and print it thousands of times. And because he was set up in London, he based this standardized spelling on the London dialect, which was heavily influenced by the commercial classes.
Which makes sense, but again, why did that ruin spelling?
Because Caxton locked in the spelling of words in the late 15th century. But human speech doesn't care about the printing press. The spoken language kept evolving, and right at this very moment, English was undergoing a massive phonetic earthquake known as the Great Vowel Shift.
Okay, we need to dive into the mechanics of the Great Vowel Shift because this is the invisible force that completely disconnected our spelling from our speaking. Why did it happen?
Linguists and historians debate the exact triggers, but it is heavily linked to massive social upheaval. Following the devastation of the Black Death, which wiped out a huge percentage of the population, there was unprecedented social mobility. People from rural areas were migrating into London, bringing all these different regional accents with them.
So London just becomes this melting pot of pronunciations.
Exactly. And in a highly stratified society, the upper classes naturally want to distinguish themselves from the new arrivals. This leads to hypercorrection. Over a few centuries, from roughly 1400 to 1700, the pronunciation of long vowels shifted entirely upward in the mouth.
Wow. Can you give us a sense of what that actually sounded like?
Sure, so if you look at Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the late 14th century, right before the shift really took hold, his English sounds almost European. A word like bite was pronounced beat. Meat was pronounced meat. Out was pronounced oot.
So beat, meat, oot.
Right, and the shift pushed beat to bite, mate to meat, and oot to out.
It completely rewired the audio of the language, but the written words were already frozen in metal on the printing press.
Exactly. So the printing press locked in the medieval spellings of Chaucer's era, while the population moved on to the modern pronunciations of Shakespeare's era and beyond. We are essentially permanently trapped writing in a 15th century accent.
That is wild, which perfectly explains the word night, right? Like K-N-I-G-H-T.
Yes, that is a classic example of this fossilization. When the spelling of night was standardized, every single one of those letters was pronounced. It sounded guttural, heavily Germanic.
K-nick.
K-nicked. The K was hard, and the G-O was a throat-clearing sound like in the Scottish Loch.
But over time, speakers just got tired of making those difficult sounds and dropped them, streamlining the pronunciation to just night. But Caxton had already locked the K and the GH into the dictionary, so the letters just sit there now, like ghosts haunting the word.
And this ties directly back to your experience as a modern listener. This is the exact mechanism behind the off words you brought up at the very start of our deep dive. Enough. Cough, though. Through thought.
Right.
Each of those words arrived in London via a slightly different regional route with different original pronunciations. Caxton and subsequent printers grabbed those regional spellings, locked them all in place, and then the great vowel shift swept through, altering how people actually said them. But the ink was already dry. They were locked in before they could be standardized phonetically.
So the printing press inadvertently created this insane playground. It gave English a rigid written form, but underneath you had this simplified, stripped-down grammar from the Vikings and this massive, bloated vocabulary from the French.
Yeah.
And once writers in the 16th century realized how flexible this machine actually was, they just went wild.
They absolutely did. The early modern English period, which is roughly 1500 to 1700, saw an explosion of vocabulary that is almost unmatched in history.
We have to talk about Shakespeare here, because he wasn't just writing good stories. He was actively hacking the mechanics of the language. I mean, he is credited with introducing or first recording over 1,700 standard words.
His methodology is what's truly fascinating to linguists. He exploited the very fact that English had lost its complex case endings. Think about it in Old English. You couldn't easily turn a noun into a verb, because you'd have to figure out all the complex suffixes to make it work grammatically.
But Shakespeare looks at the streamlined English engine and realizes, wait, there are no rules stopping me from just using a noun as a verb.
Exactly. Linguists call this zero derivation or functional shift. Shakespeare would take a noun, like elbow, and just use it as a verb. He elbowed him. Or he would take a noun like bedroom and just create it by smashing two existing words together.
He just duct taped them together.
Yeah. He added prefixes and suffixes with reckless abandon to create words we use every day now. Words like addiction, lonely, generous, gloomy, swagger, watchdog, zany.
He really just treated the language like Lego bricks, just snapping pieces together to fit the iambic pentameter of his plays. But, while Shakespeare was modernizing the vocabulary, he was still using fading grammar like thou art and he hath.
Sure.
But then you have the 1611 King James Bible, which did something completely different. It hard-coded massive cultural idioms directly into everyday speech.
Oh, absolutely. The King James translation arguably had a deeper impact on everyday syntax and speech patterns than Shakespeare did. It was read aloud in churches across the country every single week for centuries. The translators deliberately used a slightly older, majestic style of English, but more importantly, they translated Hebrew and Greek idioms very literally.
Which forced English to absorb completely foreign metaphors.
And those metaphors became foundational English phrases. When you say someone bites the dust or is a drop in the bucket or the blind leading the blind, you are quoting the King James Bible. A wolf in sheep's clothing, the skin of your teeth, putting words in someone's mouth. These are conceptual frameworks imported directly from ancient texts and permanently installed into the English operating system.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this era proves that English actually thrives on rule breaking. The simplified grammar allowed for this extreme linguistic creativity. But having built this massive, flexible vocabulary engine, Britain didn't just keep it on their damp little island.
No, they definitely did not.
They exported it globally, where it mutated all over again.
Between the 17th and 19th centuries, through global trade, settler colonialism, and violent imperial conquest, the British exported English to literally every corner of the globe. And the moment English touched a new environment, every single encounter transformed it. The same mechanisms of adaptation we saw with the Vikings and the French kicked in immediately.
Because you can't describe a completely foreign landscape using only the vocabulary of, medieval England. You don't have the words for it.
Exactly. When British settlers arrived in North America, they encountered flora, fauna, and indigenous technologies that simply didn't exist in English. So they practiced ecological borrowing. American English absorbed words from Algonquian and other Native American languages, words like raccoon, squash, moose, chipmunk, hickory, canoe.
And then millions of immigrants arrive later, German, Dutch, Italian, Yiddish speakers, and they just dump their vocabularies into the American English pot, giving us things like pretzel, kindergarten, cookie, bagel, mafia.
And a similar ecological borrowing happened in Australia. The settlers had no words for the reality they were seeing, so Australian English took in Aboriginal words, giving us kangaroo, boomerang, wallaby, wombat, billabong.
But in India, the scale of interaction created something entirely unique, didn't it?
Oh, yes. Under British colonial rule in India, you had English heavily interacting with Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, and dozens of other languages. And it wasn't just borrowing a few nouns for animals, it was a deep structural and rhythmic fusion.
So it actually changed the grammar.
Yes, Indian languages influenced the syntax of English spoken there, developing distinct grammatical patterns. For instance, the use of the progressive tense for states of being so, saying, I am understanding instead of I understand. This evolved into a vibrant, distinct variety of English, sometimes called Hinglish, which is now spoken by hundreds of millions of people.
This global spread is fascinating, but, we cannot talk about the export of English without confronting the dark side of this spread. We have to talk about how the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade shaped the language.
We do, because it is arguably one of the most profound linguistic crucibles in modern history. The slave trade was an environment of unimaginable brutality, deliberately designed to strip away humanity and culture. To prevent rebellion, slavers deliberately mixed captured individuals from dozens of completely different West African ethno-linguistic groups.
Right, so you have people who speak Wolof, Akan, Yoruba, and Igbo suddenly chained together. They are entirely unable to understand one another, and they are forced to communicate using the vocabulary of their captors.
And this is where the human capacity for language creation is just staggering. In these desperate survival situations in West Africa, the Caribbean, and the American South, enslaved people took the raw phonetic and lexical materials of English and mapped them onto the deep grammatical structures of West African languages. This forced mixing birthed incredibly creative varieties of English.
Which eventually evolved into African American English. Can we break down the mechanics of how that mapping actually works? Because I feel like this completely dismantles the racist idea that African American English is just quote unquote broken or lazy standard English.
It dismantles it entirely. African American English, or AAE, is highly systematic and rule-bound. Its rules just descend from a different grammatical tree. A perfect example of this is the habitual be.
Okay, how does that work?
So in standard English, if I say he is working, you don't actually know if he's working right this second, or if he just has a steady job. Standard English relies entirely on context.
Right, I'd have to say he is working right now or he works every Tuesday.
Exactly. But many West African languages have specific, distinct verb tenses to indicate habitual ongoing action versus immediate action. AAE retained this highly sophisticated grammatical distinction and mapped the English word be onto it. So in AAE, he working without the be means he is working right at this exact moment.
Oh, I see.
But he be working means he works habitually, constantly, as a matter of routine.
Wait, that is actually a more precise, sophisticated tense system than standard English possesses.
It absolutely is. It is a distinct, complex grammatical feature born from profound trauma and forced linguistic innovation. And over centuries, AAE has become one of the most culturally influential varieties of English on the planet. Through music, literature, digital culture, and social media, the syntax and vocabulary of AAE constantly feed into global mainstream English, heavily contributing to global pop culture and shaping how the world speaks today.
Which perfectly brings us to the radical conclusion of this whole deep dive. We've tracked this language from Germanic tribes to Viking invasions, French lords, rogue printers, and global empires. And all of this history leads to the reality of what English actually is today.
Which is that today, English genuinely no longer belongs to England.
Or America.
Right. It doesn't belong to any one country or culture. The demographics have flipped completely. Today, the vast majority of English speakers on Earth are non-native speakers. Second, third, and fourth language speakers vastly outnumber native speakers.
So internet English, global pop culture, scientific English, it's all being shaped by people bringing their own first language frameworks into English.
Yes.
So what does this all mean? Like, what does this mean for people who obsess over proper grammar and pure English? Because on the ground, standard English is still heavily gatekept. If you don't speak it, you get locked out of jobs, academia.
You are absolutely right about the social reality. Standard English is enforced as a mechanism of power and class gatekeeping, but linguistically speaking, language change is not decay. English was never pure. It was always a hybrid, mongrel system. Standard English is just the dialect that happened to have an army and a navy behind it.
Just the dialect of the people who owned the printing presses.
Precisely. The English of 2050 will sound completely different from today, just as 1950 differed from 1850. When a teenager invents a new slang term or a global community adopts an English word and changes its meaning, they aren't ruining the language. They are participating in the exact same mechanism of change that gave us Shakespeare's vocabulary and the Vikings' pronouns.
So to you listening, English is not a fixed monument you have to master or polish under glass. It is a living, breathing, biological system. And by speaking it, by making mistakes, by blending it with other languages, you are actively participating in its evolution.
You're operating one of the most adaptable, resilient linguistic engines in human history.
What an incredible way to view it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the messy, violent, brilliant history of the language.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. But before we wrap up, I do want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. We spent time unpacking how the 15th century printing press permanently froze our chaotic spelling, trapping us in a medieval phonetic gap.
Oh.
But look at the digital age we are in now. As Internet English continues to evolve globally, will artificial intelligence, predictive text, and autocorrect act as a modern printing press?
Oh, wow.
Will these algorithms force a new, rigid standardization on global English? Or will the way we type and the way we actually speak to each other eventually diverge so drastically that they fracture into two entirely separate languages?
An algorithmic printing press freezing the language all over again. That is a wild, slightly terrifying thought to leave on. Keep listening, keep questioning, and above all, enjoy being part of the greatest linguistic organism in